I apologize, I was on mute. Welcome everyone. I want to welcome you all to our program today, keeping abreast of the development of vaccines to prevent COVID-19, what clinicians need to know. I'm Michael Mina. I'm an assistant professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I'm also a physician at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues, Dr. Tara Smith and Dr. Onyema Ogbuagu. I'll let Tara and Dr. and Onyema, could you please introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'm Tara Smith. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist at Kent State University in Ohio. My main focus is on zoonotic disease, but I also do research in vaccine hesitancy and uptake.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Onyema Ogbuagu. I'm an associate professor of medicine at Yale. I'm also an infectious disease specialist. I direct an HIV clinical trials program that's focused on therapeutics. And like so many others in the field, we've kind of pivoted to COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines.
Thank you. So our faculty disclosure should be displayed on the screen for you there. And our program today is the second in a series of live streams about vaccines, specifically, not surprisingly, about COVID-19. The focus today is going to be focused on vaccine hesitancy. And so we'll be largely trying to discuss communication educational strategies and different approaches to encourage uptake of vaccination in the community to prevent COVID-19. So I want to start with you, Dr. Ogbuagu. Could you start with giving us an update on the current status of the virus and where we are with some of the vaccines?
All right, thank you, Dr. Mina. And we just have a few slides to go through. This slide shows the current COVID-19 cases and deaths in the US as of April 13, 2021. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anyone that the COVID pandemic is not over at all. If you look at the figure, the look showing the cases, you can see that there's been a significant uptick in the number of cases that have occurred more recently. There's a lot of conversation around, are we going to have a fourth wave of infection? And certainly in some parts of the country, Michigan being the poster child, really having a surge in cases, fueled by the variant and some other factors. So to date, roughly about 31 million cases. And I think the weekly average is still about 70,000 cases. And that's higher than it was, even a couple of weeks or months ago after we had come down from the third wave. Unfortunately, there continues to be deaths, and we know that there were 328 deaths reported as of April 13th, but I think the 7-day moving average is still in the high 700s. As everyone is aware, we know that the diagnosed cases always precede hospitalizations and deaths. And so given the recent increase in cases, we'll see what happens with the deaths. But obviously, given the vaccine rollout and what are now emerging reports of lower cases in older individuals, hopefully the death trends may not follow the trends in hospitalizations. So not out of the wood yet, and still remains quite concerning. Now, this next slide shows the COVID-19 cases in the US by race and ethnicity. And I think, again, probably no surprise to this audience that had always been recognized that COVID-19 had really unmasked a lot of health disparities and that disproportionately impact racial ethnic minorities in the United States. And so this the figure shows cases over time and color-coded by the different racial ethnic groups, as you can see. So if you just want to look at the gray shaded area, which is more contemporary data, you can see that Hispanics, if you look at the incident cases per 100,000 population, the cases in Hispanics are much higher, or Latinx individuals, than compared to Blacks, which are next numerically, and then whites, Hispanics, etc. Whites and other races, particularly. I think it's been interesting to see that again the spike in the cases among Hispanic or Latinx individuals, and some of those same old factors that we are aware of. The fact that the individuals within that ethnic group tend to be involved in much of the essential service type professions, including the hospitality industry, There's also maybe large household sizes, and and in some cases later presentation following symptom onset to hospitalizations have been described as well. So these disparities remain concerning. And, I think coupled with what would be the topic for today, which is focusing on vaccine hesitancy, obviously the concern is that if there's a disproportionate hesitancy among these racial ethnic groups, that these disparities are only going to be accentuated in the future. Now, this is the slide again looking at deaths by race and ethnicity as well over, literally the period of the pandemic from, early March through April 2021. And I think the good news is that you can clearly see what looks like 3 peaks of deaths, if you will. The earlier part of, April, May 2020, and then the summer bump, and then, the third, spike over the holiday period in early January. It's nice to see that the number of deaths have been declining. And like I mentioned previously, we hope that those trends continue to go down over time. Again, there's been a little bit of convergence of the number of incident deaths per 100,000 population over time, although historically, again, it appeared that there was some disproportionate impact of deaths, especially in the early period for ethnic and racial minorities. So I think we've come from an era where there was a bit of COVID-19 denialism, and that still continues to exist, and certainly has impacted individuals' ability to be willing to adhere to public health guidance as to protections in the COVID-19 pandemic, but also probably also fueling vaccine hesitancy. But we've seen that those numbers are trending down over time. And I think one of the factors that's clearly playing into this is that there continues to be a growing number of adults in the United States who really had that personal touch of COVID-19. And, so this figure shows the percentage of US adults who either have personally known someone who has either been hospitalized or died as a result of having COVID-19. And that number, as you can imagine, continues to increase over time. And so, the pandemic continues to impact a lot of individuals in so many more ways than we measure medically. And in some sense, I think that if there were any positive side to it, is that, people are taking the pandemic a little more seriously. So we have a few exciting slides about COVID-19 vaccine administration and development status. Nice for us to catch up on where we are with some of the candidates. But it's always great to just think back and really just, again, just marvel, frankly, about how we've been so successful in a short period to have really highly effective and safe vaccines developed for COVID-19. So the traditional paradigm is up there. And I think many of us know that, prior to the development of COVID-19 vaccines, I think the shortest period for vaccine development going through all the phases, I think, was the mumps vaccine that took about 4 years. And typically is, in preclinical studies, identifying what the target of the vaccine should be, collaborations between partners to develop a vaccine, and then going through the human trials, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, leading up to licensure, followed by large-scale manufacturing. It's pretty clear that paradigm was not going to be okay or sufficient for COVID-19. I don't think any of us has 4 or 5 years to wait for an effective and safe COVID-19 vaccine. So it's always nice to think about the ways in which things have been done differently to achieve what I think has really been a stellar success from the vaccine development process. And so, we knew some things from the prior coronaviruses, so it was pretty clear what the target of vaccines should be, and that the spike protein would be certainly the target. And then, rapid collaboration between biotech firms and pharmaceuticals and academic centers and clinical trials networks and resource mobilization, from all kinds of, governments in some cases, really it provided the framework for really rapid development of the vaccines. Important to mention that there really wasn't any shortcuts taken in the development process. However, I mean, the phases were done much more efficiently and effectively, if you will, so that once a vaccine candidate was identified, they went quickly into, had preclinical trials done, which in some cases helped define what the optimal vaccine candidates would be. You could do viral challenge studies, for example, to see how the vaccines protected against carrying the virus or having a clinical disease. And you also then move to safety trials in humans and then accelerated through the different phases of clinical trials, assessing for safety and efficacy. And so there was really an overlap with one phase, leading into the other. And while this was going on, there were efforts to have, to really produce the vaccines on a large scale, in many cases, even starting before there were regulatory submissions. So this has been a great model, and I think it'll serve us well in the future, even for other infectious disease or other biothreats. Next slide. And so I know this is a busy table, but we know that some of the advanced vaccine candidates have been the messenger RNA vaccines, the poster children for that being the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, the viral vector Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, and the Novavax trial. There are differences in the dosing. Majority of these platforms have studied 2 doses, either 3 weeks or 4 weeks apart, with the Johnson & Johnson studying a 1-dose vaccine, even though they have a 2-dose vaccine. There's different cold chain requirements, again, with the messenger RNA vaccines really requiring much more ultra cold, especially for refrigerator, which can pose a challenge to low middle income countries in the world, but also even parts of the United States that don't have the infrastructure to store such vaccines. We know that some of these phase 3 trials have led to emergency use authorization by the FDA, age 16 and up for Pfizer, and then for adults for Moderna, and now the Johnson & Johnson, although we know that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was just held this week for the CDC to review the few cases of unusual clots and thrombocytopenia that have occurred in predominantly women, and that's appropriately being reviewed. And the good news sometime earlier on was that the Pfizer vaccine data in 12 to 15-year-olds was really quite great, and the filing has been placed with the FDA to extend the EUA to the 12 to 15-year-olds. Next slide. And so we thought to just give you a summary of some of the high-level data for the phase 3 trials for each of these vaccine platforms. Again, majority of them had between 30,000 to mid 40,000 participants. The classic sample size. Again, efficacy varied depending on what the endpoint was. And the great news is that we had data after 2 months of follow-up initially, and now we have 6-month data from Pfizer showing 91% protection. Moderna just reported the 6-month data about 90%, and also we have the efficacy for the Janssen at 66%, AstraZeneca 76%, and actually found higher efficacy in older individuals. One important point to make here is that any one of these vaccine candidates does provide excellent protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and death, as high as 100% protection against hospitalization and death. And this has been a great selling point when having conversations with patients, especially in the setting of vaccine hesitancy. It's been very, very nice message. Obviously, the variants are of concern, and we've seen that Novavax, AstraZeneca, and Johnson & Johnson all performed a little less well in the setting of the B.1.351 variant. However, we just learned from Pfizer that their vaccine actually did protect quite well against the B.1.351. Otherwise, we have in vitro data suggesting that there may be a little bit of a hit in the neutralization potency of the vaccines in the setting of many of these variants. Next slide. Okay, so just to mention the side effects, again, flu-like symptoms are the norm and can affect up to half of the individuals who get these vaccines. These tend to be mild to moderate, in the most part happen, within the first few days of getting the vaccine and resolve pretty quickly. There have been very, very few serious adverse events that occurred, but many of these are not related to receiving the vaccine. Anaphylaxis has gotten a lot of press, and the number of cases continues to be small, with about 5 cases per million, and about half of that in the Moderna vaccine. So again, the vaccines really have shown a very great safety record, and we're seeing that the real world data or experience seems to mirror what happened in the clinical trials, which is great. Next slide. Okay, so just wanted to give you a snapshot of what's happening with vaccinations. It's just amazing how we've almost gotten we've gotten great at administering these vaccines, with up to 3 million and some days hitting 4 million vaccinations a day, which is just beyond impressive. And those numbers continue to go up, with about 37% of the total population getting at least one dose of a vaccine, and about 22.7%. We're a long way to go from herd immunity, but this is a good start. And many states continue to open up their vaccination programs to individuals even as young as age 16. Hopefully, these numbers will go up. And I think really the final barrier to achieving herd immunity, or getting these numbers optimally up, would certainly be vaccine hesitancy, which we're addressing to date. Next slide. All right, so Dr. Mina, back to you. So do you want to give us some background about the historical impact of vaccines on public health?
Absolutely, happy to. Obviously vaccines, I think most probably recognize that vaccines have been some of the most crucial tools against infectious diseases for a huge array of pathogens. And some of the most important ones, measles, for instance, is a pathogen that today most people, especially in North America, for example, and much of the world, have actually never met somebody with measles, despite this virus being a virus with an R0 of somewhere between 12 and 18, meaning that it was so transmissible that it used to infect essentially every individual before they were 5 or 10 years old. And in fact, what a lot of my prior research has shown is that measles actually had even greater damaging effects to the immune system than we previously recognized, in the form of what we call immunological amnesia, or essentially the virus would erase segments of people's immunological repertoires or their memory against other pathogens. So the introduction of the measles vaccine was incredibly important, not just to reduce measles and eliminate measles from much of the world, but also to improve our immunological memory against other infections that individuals got exposed to before they would get measles. Polio is another massively important vaccine that was essentially developed in the 50s and really started to be rolled out and has just had an incredible impact to essentially eliminate from most of the world a disease that is just horrendous and has taken and is just a disease that nobody wants to return. Next slide. Diphtheria and pertussis are also similar stories. Both of these are diseases that have plagued humans for for essentially since we've been around, and the introduction of these vaccines led to swift declines in these pathogens in very short order. And so what we're seeing here is, of course, what most people have already been able to intuit if you haven't seen these graphs, is that these vaccines have played absolutely tremendous and crucial roles to eliminate these pathogens from most of our normal experiences as humans and the experiences of our kids, for example. And getting rid of them has been immensely important. Hepatitis B and varicella or chickenpox have also been crucial. The Hep B vaccine, when it was essentially was introduced back in the 80s, and once it was included into the infant vaccine schedule, it really began to take on a much more prominent role to essentially reduce reported cases of hepatitis B, especially in children, very swiftly to today, where it is it's of course still important, but the vaccine has really done a good job at reducing the burden that this virus plays, particularly in kids. And then varicella is one of the most interesting ones, I think, recently, in part because it's one of the more recent vaccines to be introduced. It's also something that many people were accustomed to getting, but it does have, it also has secondary consequences. Getting chickenpox or varicella did have a fairly significant effect on bacterial secondary infections, for example. And the introduction of the vaccine in the mid-90s has really taken it to become a pathogen that, again, most kids today have never actually experienced as a result of this particular vaccine. Next slide. So there's a huge array of different outcomes and ways that we could be looking at the benefits of vaccines, and they spread it from everything from health, which is the most obvious potential outcome that you'd measure post-vaccination, is the actual reduction, for example, in the pathogens in the community. But the economic and social values of vaccines are huge. Of course, the introduction of different vaccines will increase for many pathogens herd immunity, but they'll also have all of these other secondary gains. For example, in the context of SARS-CoV-2, the introduction of the vaccine is improving our social activity, something we don't normally associate with a vaccine effect. It's benefiting our ability to go and receive our normal healthcare checkups, our screening programs, whatever else we might be going to physicians for. Many of those activities were put on hold, of course, as a result of this pandemic. And the introduction of vaccines has improved our ability to continue getting the care and giving the care that patients need. Productivity in the workplace, local business activity. Obviously, this virus has taken a major toll on the world, and the improvements that are benefiting from the introduction of these vaccines are vast. And then there's other additional effects, like a reduction in fear. This virus, I would say, by almost any metric, has been exceedingly stressful for billions of people on the planet. It's been one, especially for more vulnerable individuals, which has been associated with significant levels of fear on a daily basis. Morbidity and mortality is now dropping as a result of the vaccine, of course. And then there's just all of these other reductions, secondary infections, which are often associated, again, with viral infections. For example, the introduction of vaccines can reduce the burden of secondary infections, reduce the burden, for example, of antimicrobial usage that would result from those secondary infections for many of the other viruses, like influenza, for example. And then back with SARS-CoV-2, the introduction of vaccines will, of course, reduce the long-term effects of this virus, long haulers, for example. And back in terms of our, in the more psychological effects, ideally, getting vaccines out into the world as quickly as possible and preventing spread from this virus will hopefully reduce post-traumatic stress and other feelings of guilt that many people have had from infecting other individuals. In particular, if somebody knows that they have unknowingly infected more vulnerable people, it's an extraordinarily taxing state to be in. So all of these pieces that come together with vaccines are absolutely crucial. And going through this list, it becomes apparent, I think, that really the direct impact on the virus is just one of just so many impacts that having a good vaccine program and a robust vaccine program, particularly during a pandemic, can really have. So I want to take a moment now and to discuss with amongst the three of us a few topics. Before anything, though, I want to jump into something that really pertains to vaccine safety, given the topic that you were just discussing, Dr. Ogbuagu, and that's the recent news, of course, about the J&J vaccine. That's front page headlines right now, so we'd be remiss not to discuss it. And I'm hoping either of you can jump in and really discuss, or where are we with that? And I'm particularly curious how you two are thinking about, what is is this a good move that we're taking to put this vaccine on pause? Obviously, it's been contentious. So I figured we'd open it up to conversation right now for this.
Sure, I can start. I think it's, of course, as you mentioned, it's controversial. And I think no matter what was done, somebody is going to take advantage of that. If we didn't pause it and, potentially there are more cases, because there could certainly be more that develop in the next couple weeks, that's going to be weaponized and used against, the CDC and FDA. And then when we do pause, that's also going to be weaponized and suggest that it's because it's a dangerous vaccine or something like that, even though it's still 1 in a million. So I think they're doing the right thing. I think that taking the time to gather some additional data, look potentially at other types of clotting that may be affected, is important. And I hope the pause is short to get this back into the supply chain, and people that want this 1-dose vaccine can get it, especially in populations that are more difficult to reach with the mRNA vaccines.
Yeah. Yeah, if I might add, I think that this has been, I think is a damned if you do, damned if you don't, frankly. So I totally agree with the characterization by the previous speaker. But again, the incidence is very low. I mean, it's less than 1 in a million, as we're aware of. And I think the epidemiology is very well defined, right? It tends to be more women and, those under the age of 50. So I feel that we, even if we're to take precautions to diminish this risk, we can be a little more targeted rather than just applying a broad pause to everyone, since we know who it predominantly affects. I think a review is good, but I think given the data we now have from AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, I think there's little doubt that there's a clear association between the vaccine and this low risk event. But I think the message we should try to get out is, again, on a population level, these vaccines are just really, really safe. This is a very, very rare complication that occurs. And I think just armed with that knowledge of who it affects, especially in settings where we have the luxury of having other vaccines, maybe we can approach it in a much more smart, narrow way than broad.
Yeah, I fully agree. So, speaking of approaching these types of topics, vaccines live in this space that is, it's one of the few times when, especially in the context of a pandemic, but even pre-COVID, where we have, they're one of the few interventions, true medical interventions, that are given to fully healthy people, which means that the bar for safety is exceedingly high compared to just about any other medical intervention. But what it also means is that people are particularly interested in what is going into their child, for example. And so, and especially in the era of social media and the internet, we have, I've personally feel that we're in the Wild West right now about how individuals get their information. Pre-COVID, this was something I was dealing with on a daily basis, primarily based around a lot of my research in measles vaccines and infections. But how should we be thinking about approaching patients and approaching the public in general, with these very complex topics? People want to know about immunity, but you can't exactly teach immunology, advanced immunology over Twitter, and certainly you can't do it, for the masses in any robust way. So how are you guys thinking about, this issue of really educating the people?
Yeah, I don't have any great answers. I do what I can little by little, but also we have to keep in mind that it is not just information or lack thereof that drives hesitancy. We know, looking at the deficit model of science communication, which was kind of dominant for a while, that, it was thought that if you could just throw all this information at people and they had all the correct information, they would make the right choices. And we know, unfortunately, that doesn't happen. So So I think for the people who are looking for that information, it's important to have, accessible sources for them. Anything from, government sites to, TikTok videos to question and answers with experts and things like that at all different levels. But we also have to keep in mind that's only going to reach, a certain percentage of people that really are looking for that information and looking to be educated, while others are sometimes miseducated already.
Yeah, and I think if people if you asked, people always want more information than less information, frankly, and I think it's really how we provide that information that's really matters. I attended a meeting recently where someone was trying to explain mRNA not getting into the messenger RNA vaccines not affecting DNA, and the person used a very nice example of like an avocado fruit, and how like the hard nut in the center was the nucleus, and how the soft green was cytoplasm, and how the mRNA vaccine didn't get into the core. And so I thought that was a very strong anecdote and story, and of course very simplistic and not the immunology class that some of us rather teach, but I think it really presents data in a way that people can relate to, can understand. And I think that can just be a powerful way. We've seen also lots of short videos out there, that go straight to the point, use lay language. WHO, CDC, everyone has those kind of material out there, and I think those can be very powerful, short, attention-grabbing messages that educate the public. Because I think an educated public obviously hopefully makes better decisions.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of teaching for every year for, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so now, a course to alternative healthcare workers who generally don't have much experience in biology, really in sort of understanding the cellular biology. And I take that opportunity both to teach about cell biology, but also teach about immunology and vaccines. And I found that there are just amazing animations out there that exist, and some of these just tools that are on the web just really allow people who have no experience with biology whatsoever to be able to visualize what's actually happening inside of a cell. I found that goes really very, very far for people to actually, even if it's not completely accurate, just to dispel this idea that vaccines are witchcraft or something. It's a very difficult thing to do, but some very simple animations or avocados actually go quite far, I think. So I think we'll move on to the next slide, which is to discuss some of the impacts of social media and lack of e-health literacy on spreading misinformation. And certainly anyone who's spent any time on Twitter or any of these sites has probably been exposed to misinformation of one type or another, and particularly when it comes to health information and health misinformation, it can be particularly damaging. So I think it's important that there's an amazing spectrum of views. The general public has actually quite a positive view of vaccines. There's actually only a very small number of people who are often, unfortunately, quite loud, but who are what I would classify as sort of I don't really like to say anti-vax very much, but true refusal of all vaccines and are truly against the notion of vaccines. But the vast majority of people who are sometimes, unfortunately, labeled as anti-vax actually are just much more in the continuum of vaccine hesitant. These are individuals who largely are either, they might be asking to delay or refuse some of their vaccines, but for the most part, they have no fundamental problem with the idea of a vaccine, except that they're scary. Giving a vaccine, my experience with people who are very vaccine hesitant or even just moderately hesitant to get vaccines, it's not about the vaccine. It's not about following people who haven't given vaccines. It's much more about people loving and caring for their child and just being scared about what exactly a vaccine is and how to, and largely it's because of just so much misinformation that does exist online. It has made it extraordinarily hard for somebody who doesn't quite who doesn't quite fully grasp all the different aspects of immunology and really understand vaccines, it is a very, very scary world to get into social media platforms and try to use that as an approach to understand whether or not to vaccinate. Next slide. And so social media platforms have, as I was mentioning, they have really taken off in terms of where what I would say sort of true anti-vax sentiment exists. And unfortunately, what has happened is a fairly small number of accounts, relatively speaking, have millions and millions, tens of millions of followers in terms of English language social media accounts. There's over 400 large accounts with almost 60 million followers on those alone. Majority of them are in the United States. Facebook and YouTube certainly hold some of the largest followings, and then Instagram and Twitter a bit less. But what is particularly concerning, I think, is that just since from 2019 to 2020, we've seen fairly large increases, and this is just accelerating. Of course, social media and the internet is accelerating always. But what we're seeing here is that this sentiment has really taken on massive followings. We've seen increases in measles outbreaks, which measles can largely be considered somewhat of a canary in the coal mine, if you will. And so as a result of increasing hesitancy to get vaccinated, we've seen massive outbreaks in Europe, for example. The Americas are no longer considered eliminated from measles. So we are seeing that this is taking a true health toll. And every time there is a large measles outbreak, for example, children unfortunately often die, and the mortality rate is quite high from it. So this is an area where we're seeing, along with many other areas, we're seeing the digital world really begin to impact our physical and health world in serious and very concrete ways. Next slide. And so social media is something that is able to accelerate vaccine misinformation. Certainly, exposure to Twitter has actually been very strongly associated with lower uptake of HPV vaccines in females, more so than socioeconomic factors. Unfortunately, misinformation, of course, travels faster. I think many of us have experienced that, around 6 times faster on Twitter than other true valid information. And so this is going to continue being a battle with misinformation spreading very quickly through these platforms, really enabling vaccine hesitancy to really take hold. So I want to bring back the three of us again to have a short discussion about this. I wanted to start with you, Dr. Smith. What do you think are, from your perspective, what are the major barriers and challenges that you've seen in terms of people's willingness to get their children or themselves vaccinated, and sort of how does that span across the vaccine hesitancy spectrum?
Yeah, I think it's believing some of these myths that are spread by some of the key anti-vaxxers that you mentioned that then kind of trickle down from those sites to local anti-vax sites, and then mommy groups. I hate to use that term, but I've been in these and I've seen some of this happen there, that it just takes a little bit of that to really scare people off. And I think people are hesitant to ask questions of their physicians and to really establish a good rapport with them, because I think when questions are asked, sometimes the parents feel blown off by just, if you just say, no, that's not true, vaccines are safe, rather than really establishing a relationship, listening to them, asking questions about, why they are concerned, and not just assuming that it's, fears about autism or fears about thimerosal or something, really digging into what their fears are. I think a lot of parents just don't feel heard in that setting. And so I think that really makes them maybe a little bit more cemented into some of their hesitancy.
And Do you two discuss vaccine misinformation or myths that appear? Like when you, I mean, obviously we see these, they kind of exist in our digital world. As you're mentioning, they definitely do bleed out into the physical and sort of real world. Do you openly try to go out and discuss those myths with people, or is it, what is your philosophy, I suppose?
Yeah, I will just say that I always try to start with their concerns. So I don't put, what my thoughts are. I ask them what they're worried about and go from there.
You might be muted there, I think.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I totally agree with what you said. I've again, having done a ton of these talks, I think someone said maybe we should reframe and not just call it vaccine hesitancy because of the negative connotations with hesitancy, but vaccine concerns. And that's a lot of the driver of people's unwillingness, or again, along the spectrum of vaccine refusal or watch and wait or wait and see approaches are valid concerns that need to be addressed. I think it's interesting that a decent chunk of, and I've seen different estimates, maybe about 40% or so of Americans consume health information from social media. And so that's a new reality that we have to accept. And in some ways, I see it as what should be almost like a Twitter war or social media battle between accurate information from trusted sources and the misinformation out there. I think the reality is people believe, what they see from any kinds of sources, and whether we like it or not, it truly has a negative impact on the public's perception of science, of vaccines, and translates into their behaviors around attitudes, around some of these. So it's a new reality. And I think that I hope one of the lessons we've learned through this pandemic is that the medical community, especially given that we are hopefully trusted voices. I think people probably trust nurses more than they trust doctors, but being trusted voices, I think that communicating that, meeting people at the point of their concerns, and I don't think there shouldn't be a homogenous message because they're varied concerns, and we just have to meet people where they are.
Yeah, e-health literacy is. I think it's going to become one of the most important pieces, and whether it's e-health literacy or just literacy around how to consume information on the internet is something that I think we're going to have to really be making a priority in K through 8 and primary schools. Is how do people even understand what is a reliable source? Of course, again, just the internet in general is sort of a wild west of information, right or wrong. And I think that working with patients, it's going to become part of the normal lexicon of physicians, I think, in the future, to help their patients figure out how to interpret Google, if you will, and social media. So it's going to be an extraordinarily probably a bumpy path, I would say, but I hope that we'll find ourselves in an equilibrium where these things start to shake out on the positive side of truth. So now, Dr. Smith, I'd love to hear more from you about vaccine hesitancy.
Absolutely. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So again, as Dr. Mina mentioned, this is not black and white. This is a spectrum of individuals, who may be fine with some vaccines but refuse others, who may, be concerned about vaccines but still get them anyway. So it's not something that is black or white, on or off. It's a whole spectrum of gray. And so the WHO did list this as one of their major global health threats about a year ago or so, because we're seeing this again. My focus, of course, is the United States, but we're seeing this across the globe. And, unfortunately, sometimes we from the United States export some of these concerns and fears around the globe. Okay, next slide. So this is one model of vaccine hesitancy, and I think it's probably as good as any other. I'm looking at some of the components that make people concerned about vaccines. And so I think with childhood vaccines especially, complacency is a big one because, as was mentioned, most people have not seen a case of measles. They don't know people who have had measles. My generation had chickenpox, but after us, the vaccine was available. So a lot of them don't even have that history of suffering from some of these childhood diseases because vaccines are so common. So, we've seen people that just don't understand, why does my child need to be vaccinated for polio? Why does my child need to be vaccinated for measles? It's so rare. But of course, it's rare because of vaccination. And so even with COVID, you would think in the midst of a global pandemic where more than 500,000 Americans have died in the past year, you would think complacency would not be a problem, but we're still seeing that, especially with younger people or people, even if they're a little bit older, but they think they're healthy and they're not in a risk group for that, trying to get them to understand that it's still important that they get vaccinated, both for their own health as well as for the health of their community. That's been kind of a difficult message to sell to some of those groups as well. So even now, in the midst of a pandemic, we're still seeing some of that complacency. And convenience is another one that we've been dealing with right now. So this comes down to, how easy it is to get vaccinated, because again, some people may not be vaccinated, not necessarily because they're against it, but because it's sometimes difficult to get themselves or their children vaccinated. If they don't have reliable transportation and maybe public transportation is not readily available, or if it is difficult for them to get out of the house, as we've seen currently with some elderly people or other people with disabilities that can't reliably get to a vaccine center. Or in some cases, if the vaccines are too costly, if they don't have insurance or some other way to pay for them, they may also be unwilling to get vaccinated because of that. And then also immigrant populations or others who maybe don't speak English. Do we have translators who can help with their facilitating their vaccines, or even, again, getting them to the sites and talking to them about what it means to be vaccinated, what the side effects are, what the potential risks are, and what the benefits are. So there's a lot of pieces that come into that convenience and ability aspect. And of course, now we're starting to get more vaccines that pretty much anyone who wants one can get one, but that wasn't present early on as well. So that's been a challenge here. And then confidence. So again, looking at the safety, the effectiveness of vaccines, who do people trust to get their information about these vaccines? And often that is healthcare providers. There's still, physicians and nurses and others in the medical field overall are still highly trusted. But people also go to, again, local parenting groups or their pastor or, other trusted people in their circles to get information about vaccines. And sometimes that information is conflicting. And so they have to figure out, who do I trust about this? What is true? And that goes back into both the e-health literacy, as well as just this idea of building these relationships with these individuals to get them to trust science and to trust the healthcare model. Okay, next slide. Oh, I guess we're on.
Thank you. So one of the most interesting things that I think you mentioned and brought up is it goes way beyond vaccines, and it's really a problem of public health in general. And vaccines live in this space which the more effective they are, and the better the outcomes of vaccines, just like with public health in general, the less people care about them. And by that, and it's hard to blame people if you don't see measles for years and you in fact think that it hasn't been around. Probably a lot of people think that measles is a virus that disappeared thousands of years ago from humans or something. But the vaccines have worked so well that there's no good reason why the average parent today of a young kid should really care about measles. Obviously, from a scientific and medical perspective, we know the literature, we know the historical background of that, but it is so hard, and I don't fully know what is the right answer for public health. It's almost as though the only way you can really keep these things, front and center and keeping people engaged is either to give some sort of incentive, which doesn't really exist in much sort of the health world right now, or to have little outbreaks every once in a while, which obviously isn't a good solution either. But on that note, I remember a discussion I was having with somebody a few years ago, asking me all about vaccines, but really was on the edge of saying, I don't really want any vaccines at all. I don't think they're important. But then they mentioned in the middle of this conversation about how they didn't think vaccines were important. They said, when's a Lyme disease vaccine going to come out? I want a Lyme disease vaccine. And that was so crystallizing for me. Of course they want a Lyme disease vaccine because that is something relevant to them right now. And I guess I'll just open it to you too. Do you have any thoughts about how you try to tackle this, or how you even frame this kind of question?
Yeah, and of course there was a Lyme disease vaccine that was removed.
Yeah.
So yeah. But no, I mean, I try to talk about my own experiences. So I did have chicken pox. It was horrible. I still have scars from it. So that's one reason why I was so anxious to get my children vaccinated, so they didn't have to deal with that. And I have an aunt that is deaf in one ear from measles. I just have a lot of family history where they had really bad infections with these. So I tried to talk about that. And those are the types of reasons why, I had my kids fully vaccinated, because I don't want them to have to deal with any of this anymore.
Yeah, I had chicken pox when I was in second year of medical school, and I still have scars from that too. So I totally understand. Yeah, we're seeing that in HIV medicine as well, right? So because there've been these great successes with antiretroviral therapy and people achieving, near normal life expectancy, and people not really being as sick as they used to be before, how it can totally there can be some just lack of, want of a better term, lack of even fear about the disease, and that reflects in people probably being a little complacent about it. And I totally agree that's the same thing with vaccines as well, because the most successful vaccines result in the diseases disappearing, and how to remind people that those diseases have disappeared because the vaccines are being utilized. But there are still pockets of the world, for example with polio, so there's always images or historical lessons to bring to the fore as to what happens in unvaccinated settings. And we have even outbreaks in the US, right? We had measles outbreaks in unvaccinated populations in the South, in New York City. I think those are great anecdotes that can be very powerful to remind people that vaccines work, and if you're unvaccinated, you could be vulnerable to disease that should have disappeared.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that neither of you, and I think what's generally becoming more commonplace, is this understanding that we're probably not going to get far with combating vaccine hesitancy through throwing data at people, especially in a social media era. And that's kind of been, I think it's been sort of a really hard transition for scientists and physicians who, many physicians generally probably in the generation above us, they were held on a certain pedestal, and what they said went. And things have changed dramatically in the last couple of decades, to a point now where the patients question the physician. And it's no longer enough just to beat somebody over the head with data. That's not, it's not the right thing to do, because most people have a difficult time understanding it. And there's always going to be, and frankly, emotions and concerns, trump data at the end of the day for the average individual. And so I do think that that's a very interesting piece, that so much of how that neither of you said that, the way to combat this is data. It is using our own experiences and using the experiences of others, or from other infectious diseases that are ongoing, that people can actually relate to. And generally, I think that what we're seeing is really a movement towards hopefully more positive, combating these things more with positive examples of why vaccines are important, rather than sort of, I think that there was sort of a time when it was all about death. And if you don't do this, there's going to be horrible problems. And it almost is too extreme, I would say, for people to really even ingest that kind of information. So we are, I think, seeing a whole a whole new slice of sort of how to just deal with health information in general, and hopefully in a much more empathetic way. So I want to move on, actually, again, to Dr. Smith. I'll just turn it back over to you to continue on.
Okay. All right. So looking at who is hesitant and why. So this isn't only, people who have no understanding of health or medicine. We see this in healthcare workers as well. And so some of the previous studies that have looked at this in healthcare workers look at this for their yearly influenza vaccination, for example. So in one study, and of course this will vary by location and facility, but they looked at healthcare workers in long-term care facilities, and only about 68% of those were vaccinated. And we've seen similar things, especially in kind of November and December, when the COVID vaccine was not yet available to healthcare workers, that a number of them were suggesting that either they weren't going to get it, or they would wait to look at the data or to see what was happening with other individuals before they got their own shot. And so this is important as a group to address, because again, healthcare workers are still one of the most trusted groups as far as vaccine information. So trying to, examine their reasons for hesitancy and what we can do to move the needle there is an important piece of this, because they can also drive hesitancy in others if they're showing that they are hesitant to receive their own vaccines. Okay, next slide. Okay, so you can go ahead and we'll talk some of the strategies. We've already, again, kind of discussed some of this. But, there are a number of different things that providers can do. So one study looked at, instead of asking individuals, are you or your child going to get this vaccine? Just say, it's recommended for you, or it's reserved for you, or it's time to get your vaccine instead, to kind of put the onus on them to say, no, I don't want this, or let's pause, or something like that. But, just having the healthcare workers assume that you will get that vaccine can actually increase acceptance of that. And then again, to look at people who are most likely to get the vaccine right now. Not surprisingly, it's people who are relatively comfortable with vaccination in general. So those who are worried about getting ill from COVID infections, those who already routinely receive the flu vaccine, who understand, the potential danger of respiratory infections, who get that yearly, and those who trust the vaccine development process. So those are the ones who are more likely to get the COVID vaccine right now. And next slide. All right, so some ways that this can be discussed. So again, first is to identify who you are talking to and establish trust. So this may be, again, with a physician-patient relationship. Obviously, you would know your target audience then, but it could be, a public forum. It could be a community event. And you need to determine, not only your message, but if you are the proper person to do that, or if you should bring somebody else in to work with you. As a white woman, I probably would not be the best person to go and talk about vaccines in a gathering of Black Southern Baptists or something like that. But I could come in and help, if there was a pastor that wanted to encourage his parishioners to get a vaccine, and he wanted to bring me in to talk about the science, and then he would relate that to his audience. That's great ways to kind of do some tag team with people who are already respected community leaders, but may not know all the science behind the vaccines. So, make sure you know who you're talking to, and also if you are the appropriate person to do that. And then just be transparent. Again, I always start with what a person's questions are, and then I answer that as much as possible with honesty. Again, telling stories, giving data if that's what they want, addressing myths if that's what they want, providing visual aids if that will help them to, again, kind of understand maybe the science about it, like a video, like an avocado, something like that. Making sure, again, that it's matched to their comprehension level. So, if I'm talking with another person who has a PhD in science or has a medical degree or something, that conversation is going to be a lot different than if I'm talking with someone who has, only a high school degree, and even then they hated biology or something like that. So try to figure out kind of where they are, and then target your information and communication to them. As far as testing this, that's difficult. I usually try to end up with, did that answer your question? Did that clear things up for you? What else do you have to ask me? Is there anything else I can clarify for you to see if they got the message and if they, can really understand that, or if they're still left just, with that going completely over their head, whatever I've talked about. Okay, next slide. All right, and so again, these are things that could be brought in. So again, this has to be in this atmosphere of mutual trust. So again, a patient that maybe you've had for years, or somebody that is new that you're being introduced to for the first time. But again, I think listening is really the most important thing here, because again, a lot of parents, I think, just don't feel heard. They feel brushed off instead of really not, getting their questions answered. So these are some other things that at least some studies have suggested could help. Again, kind of rather than asking about vaccines, just offering them or assuming they're going to be administered, some of these reminder systems, either in text or other things that can set that up. And, really just making it as easy as possible for everyone involved. And sometimes that can include things like mandatory vaccination. So that's always kind of a tricky issue. Sometimes mandatory vaccination may increase hesitancy if people think, why is this vaccine being required for something? If it was safe and effective, wouldn't people just want to take it? But we've seen, like, for the example, in school settings, that places who do have mandatory vaccination and have fewer exemptions to those mandatory vaccinations do have higher vaccine uptake. So sometimes it is that little push that some parents or individuals may need to get vaccinated. So we're seeing that, of course, play out right now with the idea of COVID passports and things like that. And I don't think there's any great research yet, one way or another, to say what is best to do for that right now. But certainly that's something that's on the radar, and whether it may be for only certain situations, we have to be careful to balance out protecting individuals, but also not driving hesitancy by making it required in some circumstances.
Well, thank you. So it looks like we are just about out of time here, but I wanted to just give both of you, do you have any additional items that you feel like we should have covered, or that you want to conclude with? Dr. Ogbuagu?
Yeah, I'll just say that, like we discussed earlier, I think the issue with getting the vaccinations up in the US was vaccine availability. That's no longer going to be an issue. I think the next barrier is going to be vaccine hesitancy. And I think that any investment in trying to address that is, critically important and necessary, especially at this point. And I think that that's really where the focus should be. We have data on who's not getting vaccinated, right? So we have that data, and I think targeting those groups, meeting them at their point, but also recognizing that we're not going to win every heart and every mind to take a vaccine. I mean, there's political affiliations, there's faith-based individuals who, and also we know that minorities as well, also, systemic mistrust, etc. So there's some things way above our pay grade as the healthcare provider who's having a conversation one-to-one with a patient about that. But I think we should just keep chipping away and hopefully make progress.
Yeah, and I like that, chipping away, because I think empathy and patience are two big things. Again, coming at the individuals where they are, helping them to understand whatever questions they have, but also understanding it may take, quite some time maybe for them to change minds. But just because maybe you don't get the answer that you want on that day, and that they may not take a vaccine on that day, doesn't necessarily mean you failed. Lots of times people just need some time to think about things. They need to talk to others. They need to watch what their friends and other trusted individuals are doing. So, don't think that just because you didn't change a mind on that day that, you had no effect. I think a lot of people take quite some time to come around on some of these issues.
I think that's a great way to end this. So to our audience, Thank you very much for joining us today. If you are looking to, please claim your CME credits. You can complete the post-test and evaluation form at integrityce.com/COVID posttest2. And have a wonderful evening, everyone.